My name is Rebecca Baker. I am a Records and Information Management Specialist at the National Institutes of Health. At NIH, I am responsible for electronic records management policy, and litigation holds. And I started this position last September. During this presentation, I would like to discuss how the NIH is considering and implementing both traditional and technical solutions to address the challenges of transitioning to electronic records management. To me, part of M1921 compliance is the ability to ensure that staff with records management responsibilities understand this transition and feel that their concerns have been addressed. Prior to joining NIH, I was an archivist within the Electronic Records Division at the National Archives. My professional and academic experience has developed my proclivity towards electronic records management and ability to foster understanding among staff regarding these changes, and then apply that experience to helping NIH achieve M1921 compliance. So diving in, I'd first like to talk about some steps that I'm sure have been mentioned, and this might be a reiteration, is preparing for that transition to electronic management, or electronic records management, excuse me. That the previous panelists were completely correct. This isn't just a records management effort, and we need stakeholders from across the agency to participate. So it may seem like a leap and an impossible task to transition from managing predominantly paper records to a hybrid of paper and digital, and then finally mostly electronic records. But it is important to note that the principles of records management are truly media neutral, and remind that of staff throughout the agency who have records management experience that has been predominantly with paper. And also acknowledge that you aren't starting from a blank canvas. Your agency has had an established records management program that has been managing paper records for many years. And also consider that there are electronic records management efforts taking place within your agency's IT department. And these might be even outside of records management influence. IT is already fulfilling obligations of preserving electronically stored information, or ESI, for litigation holds, as well as addressing cybersecurity concerns to protect electronic systems and the data housed inside them. So we'd like to build off these previous achievements, such as M1218 compliance and implementing a solution for email, and then engage leadership by reframing M1921 as an opportunity to modernize. And one strategy to help get leadership buy-in is to maintain a strong relationship with your senior agency official for records management and departmental records officer, because with their support, you can further engage leadership and get that buy-in from all relevant program areas. And we'd like to also strengthen relationship with these relevant program areas, such as IT, FOIA, privacy, OGC, ethics, and system owners. These relationships will allow you to better understand the situation at your agency and identify where records management can and should have a seat at the table to be a part of the decision-making process. And instead of being retroactive, get to proactively make these decisions. So if any agency is struggling with the scope of this transition, try using data to find a starting point. Request the NARA 01 holding report from your FRC account representative, because this report will help you identify offices that are creating a lot of paper records. And then you want to target your efforts to assist these offices and, and then understand how you could then modernize these workflows and move away from paper processes to an electronic process. Ideally, your agency should have an inventory of all electronic information systems. And you should communicate with IT enterprise architecture staff to discuss this inventory and how records management can be integrated into the process of implementing and eventually sunsetting these systems. And having those relationships with other program areas can help push that initiative from just being conceptualized to reality. You will get pushback because records management will then become another signature among many that programs need to have to get their systems to have authority to operate. But being involved in that process will let you ensure that all systems have a records retention policy that is applied to them. They've identified privacy concerns and give you a description of what type of records are going to be stored in that system. Another tactic is performing a variety of data calls. And for example, identify all electronic information systems that contain essential records. Find out how offices are storing their records using FRCs, commercial storage, or on-premise storage. It's particularly important to understand what on-premise storage solutions are taking place at your agency, as M1921 requirements will have us moving away from those on-premise storage locations to either getting our paper records in the FRCs, digitizing them, or then having even our electronic records being stored in a commercial setting. So, and one other data call could be the ability to check in on an office's ability to respond to FOIA requests. And this will help you gauge the discoverability of each program area. Do they have their records indexed? Do they have proper metadata? What are the search functionalities in these systems? And where are the opportunities to promote discoverability? Program reviews will also provide valuable data and allow you to see the maturity of records management efforts within programs throughout your agency. These should be done to a variety of programs annually. And keep track of those records so you have a baseline and see the progression of programs over time. You can modernize file plans into a searchable system so you can keep track of the records each office is producing and minimize the risk of unscheduled records. NIH has implemented the record scheduling system, or RSS, that allows users to search for relevant record schedules, both from GRS or NIH-specific schedules, and then create and manage file plans using those record schedule items. And it's a much more intuitive process and less cumbersome than paper file plans or complicated Excel workbooks that I'm sure all of you have had enough of. So, and then finally, it's important to try not to overwhelm staff with all the requirements of M1921. Instead, come to the discussion with concise communication that targets the focus of your concerns and provide open lines of communication followed up by guidance and training to address stakeholder concerns. So as we prepare for this transition and have all of those building blocks in place, now we want to address the specific concerns with electronic records. So staff with a history of paper records management responsibilities often have the concerns listed on this slide regarding electronic records management. And these concerns are implementing standards, addressing file formats, identifying what metadata is and what those requirements are, how to promote accessibility, how to ensure security, how to properly maintain these records throughout the retention period and then have permanent federal records ready for long-term preservation, and then how to address migration concerns. So the first three concerns listed are absolutely critical to understand and provide guidance for, since these elements impact the other concerns listed. So first, implementing standards. Implementing standards promotes compliance and discoverability. Just like folders in a filing cabinet, born digital and digitized files and folders in an electronic storage location should conform to standard naming conventions applied agency-wide. NARA has useful guidance on file naming conventions that you may reference for staff. And sometimes it's beneficial to provide unique examples specific to your agency so the information is adequately conveyed. NARA also provides guidance on metadata and file formats that can be used to set the standards within your agency. Incorporate records management standards into the procurement process and the sunsetting process for electronic information systems. As I had stated before, having your signature as a line item of getting approval that the records management concerns have been addressed at the authority to operate, to the sunsetting, and then storage of that data for the length of its retention period. Or the potential migration to a new system. It's important to ensure that there are protections in place across the agency to prevent unauthorized access, modification, and/or deletion of federal data. This will protect the integrity of files throughout the records lifecycle. And this isn't an effort that records management programs can do alone. This requires a strong collaborative relationship with IT because the IT staff are the individuals actually acting on these policies and standards and making sure that it's a feasible practice for agency-wide and for a wealth of different program areas, potentially in disparate locations and just sometimes at such a scale. So moving on to file formats, NARA has published guidance on preferred and acceptable file formats for all types of electronic federal records. Provide this information to all records management related staff. Recommend that staff consider file formats when procuring a system and identify what type of file formats a system or application can import and export. Convey that it is highly not recommended to use systems that require proprietary formats or don't allow the export of data in an open format that doesn't require specific software to be viewable and rendered. Recommend using open file formats along with proper documentation whenever possible, especially for permanent records since this documentation is absolutely required. Ask staff with records management responsibilities what file formats are predominantly being created within their office. The Electronic Information System Inventory is also a good starting place to gather information and then speak with your network of record liaisons, record custodians, and potentially system owners to understand what types of temporary and permanent federal records are being created. From my experience at the National Archives working with transfers of permanent electronic data, often when we would go through the accessioning process, we're not only talking to the records officer, we're talking to the program staff, the DBAs, the IT staff, and just going through what format are these records in currently? How can you export them? What existing documentation is there? Can you provide code lists, translations, any type of data dictionaries? Because, I mean, let's be honest, in practice, data dictionaries and code lists aren't typically created during the life cycle of the system. I mean, if they are, that's wonderful, that's best practice, but at times, this is something that you're then asking a DBA to do maybe 10, 20 years after the system's been created. And they likely haven't been there as all the changes have happened and tables start not to be used and they don't really understand why these tables were there in the first place and so forth. So it's very important to have those discussions as record officers with your program staff and with your NARA accessioning archivist to understand and address any file format concerns, because to be honest, there have been accessions I've processed that were outside of the preferred and acceptable file formats. And that's just the reality of working with electronic records. NARA can't stop an agency from procuring a system that produces proprietary files. And it's the effort of records management to proactively identify those types of systems that cause concern and see if there's any way we can mitigate that risk and find a better solution to be more compliant to using open formats. And so enough about file formats. I'll talk about some metadata. So I simply cannot stress enough how important documentation is regarding electronic files. And drawing back from my NARA experience, one of my most challenging accessions was processing over 10 million files that were received on an external hard drive with a sticky note that said, "For NARA." That note, along with a few README files, was the extent of the documentation. And before I dive right into that, I'll speak more on this experience and provide the solutions that I had to successfully process that accession when I discuss technical solutions. So NARA has metadata requirements for permanent electronic records, digitized temporary records, and then forthcoming guidance on digitizing permanent records. And I can just say the forthcoming guidance has extensive description about all the required metadata fields, and it will give you a wealth of information to work on. And depending on the type of electronic record, be it born digital, digitized, and then temporary or permanent, you should use, use this as the basis, for educating staff on metadata that must be created and then accompany those electronic federal records. And also participate with your staff, ask staff what their concerns are regarding metadata, and focus training to address those concerns. Recently, at a NIH Record Liaison quarterly meeting, I provided a demonstration and training on metadata, from simply explaining what is metadata and what is metadata beyond the definition of data about data or information about data, and giving them real-world examples of NIH records to show descriptive metadata, structural metadata, technical and preservation, and so forth, and letting them be aware of the 9 requirements for permanent federal records, and then how you'll actually see them and how you can change your systems to include that type of information. So as NARA requirements are updated, because we can't assume that these are static, as the world changes, as electronic records management changes, guidance and requirements will change. So it's important to inform staff of these changes and how it will impact their work. The more informed staff are about these requirements, the easier it will be to successfully transition. And then moving on to accessibility. So accessibility is another major concern for a multitude of reasons. If files are in proprietary formats, they may be inaccessible when the software or system is no longer supported, or when you need to migrate to an updated version of that system. Many applications do not support backwards compatibility, or if they do, it's for very limited versions. And if you aren't proactively updating these systems and applications and you start to miss a few versions, you might reach that threshold in which the data that you have can't be easily and migrated in a lossless manner, because just the format and the source code for that system is changed. And then even for niche applications, it's really important to discuss with IT keeping source code, keeping documentation, because you might not see if a system is in place for a long period of time and that source code gets lost, if if you have to then do migrations, things start failing, there's security breaches because the system relies on different hosting capabilities that are no longer secure, it might be near impossible, or you might have to ask your programmers to completely recode that system. And instead of asking them to do that redundant work, keeping that source code and keeping that documentation can avoid future headache to then manage those electronic records correctly. And also, a final note for accessibility. Without file naming standards, it is tremendously difficult to retrieve relevant records. Your agency might not be able to fulfill FOIA requests or discover relevant ESI that is responsible or responsive to a litigation hold. So having those file naming standards, and then furthermore having tools that can index and perform full text search, just promotes that accessibility and that ability to discover what you have and then fulfill your legal, financial, and records management and other obligations. And now security. So for security, there are a wealth of cybersecurity risk for systems. And these are risks and concerns that require discussions with IT, and then even furthermore, being part of an information governance process. So you can see all of the agency-wide stakeholders and address their security-related concerns. And then have a proactive part of the decision-making process to bake records management into that governance process. So as other panelists and presenters have mentioned, use GovCloud tenants. And as we're all migrating to cloud, it's important to note that not all clouds are the same. There are specific clouds that are made for the government that conform to the risk and all of the regulations and laws and policies in place for supporting federal electronic records. And these may be more restrictive than commercial cloud. And that's something, if you don't know about it, or if and you're trying to find a solution, you might find yourself in that type of situation where you're looking for something in the cloud and you might go to the wrong cloud. So it's very important to be aware of using government appropriate tenants. And then, as I had stated, it's critical to keep systems and software applications updated. This avoids exploits. When software becomes out of date, there are exploits and malicious cracks in that system that lead it to be susceptible to breaches. And no one wants to be presenting to Congress and testifying of why their system led to a terrible breach of the public's data or even of the agency's data. And you should ensure that IT has set permissions to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive information. So only allow users with a legitimate work-related need to access or modify sensitive information. And this is for the entire records lifecycle, to the point of creation, through business use, and then even more so once it reaches the end of business use and you're still housing it for the rest of that retention period, really lock down on the ability for individuals to access that data and especially modify or delete it in any way. If they can only have read-only access, you then mitigate the issues of any writing or modification to those records. And it ensures the integrity of files throughout that records lifecycle. If possible, have IT retain system logs that track access, modifications, and deletions for systems with sensitive data or systems that contain permanent federal records. If you can then track and you have the option of versioning, if something happens and it's an unauthorized modification or deletion, you could then go back to the previous version and maintain that provenance and have the official record as it should be. Another possibility is asking IT whether an application has an area in the backend of the system for admin-only access, which stops files from being truly deleted until a set amount of time after the user deletes the file. So the user might think that they deleted that email or they deleted that report, and it's actually in an admin-only accessible area to be recovered or to then be retained because it shouldn't have been deleted in the first place. And that goes hand in hand with metadata tagging and auto classification, because if you can apply retention policies and show that that record is a permanent record, even if an individual deleted it, or you'll be able to recover it. And that way it's impossible to ask staff to do that in a manual process. So having that automated process that might notify you that something needs attention is kind of critical at that point. And now onto maintenance and long-term preservation. So electronic records require proactive maintenance. Both paper and electronic records are subject to preservation concerns. But unlike paper, electronic records are susceptible to corruption and bit rot and can not simply be left on physical media until they reach disposition. And in order to support the long-term preservation of these files, you need IT to help ensure that the files are being sampled for corruption on a regular basis throughout the retention period, and that there is some method in place to identify if a file has been modified. One method could be getting a baseline of the SHA hash code value for a record once it's ended business use. And then once you have that baseline, when you sample files, also compare those SHA values from the time that the file reached the end of business use to the end of the retention period. And there you can assure that the file wasn't modified. And it's also important to then give those values to provide that to the National Archives as additional metadata. And then NARA can then verify that the files made a lossless transfer and we have what we should have in a repository for long-term preservation. And then finally, migration. So for migration, you need to come up with standards and records management guidance for discussing migration between software versions, as well as how to export files and import files into different systems if a system is no longer being supported or purchased by the agency. Provide this guidance to record liaisons, who then share this with records custodians and system owners. Knowing the importance of lossless migration will decrease the likelihood of records being purged when systems are updated or changed. And if these system owners are aware that there are legal implications of purging this data, that might make them a little more cautious and ensure that everything was retained. So now, moving away from the concerns with electronic records, I'd like to discuss some traditional solutions to ease in the transition to electronic records management. So if your agency's records management program doesn't already have a network of record liaisons and records custodians, prioritize creating and maintaining this network throughout the program areas in your agency. Creating this network will require leadership buy-in and relationships with pretty much all of the program areas at your agency. For example, the NIH is comprised of 27 institutes, centers, and offices called ICOs. Each ICO has both primary and alternate record liaisons. The offices within each ICO have designated records custodians who understand the record systems of that specific office. And this facilitates top-down communication as you share information with record liaisons who then disseminate it to records custodians. And it's very important to meet with record liaisons regularly to keep them up to date on current issues, training, and communication, as well as providing an an environment that they feel comfortable introducing their own issues and concerns that they might be experiencing or could use guidance on. At NIH, we have quarterly record liaisons meetings, and there we discuss a variety of topics of updates, training, anything that the record liaison should be aware of. And we're also starting to ask the record liaisons if what topics they want covered or would they like to present on their own issue to facilitate that active engagement and participation. And finally, it's important to keep the list of record liaisons updated to maintain accuracy and coverage, because there might be retention issues. Someone goes on a detail or they leave that program area, and you want to fill those gaps to make sure that a program area has the support it needs. And now that's especially important as we're transitioning to electronic records and it's not the same status quo. So next, it's important to become part of the information governance process. This will enable you to have a seat at the table while the agency is creating, implementing, and evaluating how information is managed at the agency. By creating and managing a network of record liaisons, you have identified staff who may have a vested interest in participating in working groups to discuss concerns and potential solutions for this transition and M1921 compliance. By identifying offices that heavily rely on the creation of paper records, you can also create working groups with targeted goals of modernizing these workflows and processes. Next, it is important to train record liaisons, as I had stated, on standards, format, metadata requirements, and do this in a variety of methods to support all learning styles. You could create guidance documents or reference established guidance from authoritative sources, such as all of the NARA information that is provided to the federal government regarding records management. And then create infographics or decision trees. Decision trees could be, well, what is a federal record? And working through the process of, is this non-record material? Is it personal? Is it temporary or is it permanent? And so someone who is new to these responsibilities, because to be honest, many of the record liaisons, even though they have records management responsibilities, this isn't their primary duty. This isn't what their background is. This is another duty as assigned. So giving them that background so they can then have the knowledge for their program area. And then doing demonstrations, like in the quarterly record liaisons meetings or in an onboarding of new record liaisons, showing them how to actively do this type of work, such as apply metadata or looking for metadata in different types of formats and identifying them, and then also record those sessions and have those on your agency's records management program intranet. So it's internal facing, but it's available for all staff inside the agency in case they weren't a part of that recording or they want to refer back to it. And then finally, for training, it's important to be available for one-on-one sessions. And you may think that that's impossible or very hard to do now in this remote work environment, but with the ability of web conferencing, sharing your screen, you can easily walk someone through or watch them as they walk through a process that they need guidance on. And now I'd like to talk about encouraging staff to participate in professional development activities. So your records management program shouldn't be the sole source for all information regarding records management. You should educate staff that there are other training opportunities such as NARA's training materials online, the various professional associations such as AIM, ARMA, SAA, NAGARA, just to name a few. And then there are also programs offered through colleges and universities that can help people get post-education certificates or even pursue another degree if they see this as something that they would like to do as a primary responsibility in their career. And then finally, if you're able to and your program has vacancies and you can get the approval, consider hiring staff with electronic records management experience to guide this transition. Because if staff have this experience, um, they will, sorry, they can then give you lessons learned and give you that information so you can avoid some of the big issues that that they might have experienced at another agency. So now moving on to technical solutions, and notice I am close to time, so I do apologize. I had a few tangents that I didn't exactly time in my previous rehearsals. So I'd like to talk about the technical solutions. And of course, there's digitization. NIH has a departmental support center called PSC, and it offers 40 different services, but the relevant services are digitization, including document imaging and scanning, supporting the disposition of source material when appropriate, storage, and then Section 508 compliance for either born digital or digitized records. And it's important whenever you negotiate these contracts for digitization, ensure that it also includes OCR for indexing and search capabilities, that it conforms to those established file and folder naming conventions, and that it includes the required metadata. So you can review that rather than creating it on your own. And then moving on to electronic document and records management systems. NIH has the Director's Document and Records Management System. It allows for the routing of official documentation and correspondence to all ICs. And it also has records management capabilities built in, and this manages the official records of the NIH Director and Principal Deputy Director. But ICOs are also using a variety of their own solutions for medical records. Then for ECM, so we all know what ECM is, so I'll dive into what NIH is doing. NIH has been in the process of implementing an ECM solution, and some of the issues that NIH had was defining the scope. So what would ECM be at NIH with 27 institutes with their own systems? And the solution was to focus on common administrative processes and workflows and not include the medical research and clinical data. And then addressing funding. So getting enterprise funding solutions, and that's going to be a multi-year process because we're going to tap into all of the ICOs and have everyone contribute to the cost of ECM. So this isn't the sole responsibility of IT or records management. And there was an existing precedence, fortunately, for this at the agency, so we could build on that precedence. And as a good news update, as of last Tuesday, the contract had been awarded for the ECM solution at NIH. So we're moving forward to getting that established. And for file analysis, I won't go into, everyone knows what file analysis can do, I hope, because I'm trying to speed this along. So NIH is in the planning stages for piloting a file analysis software. And once we progress through the planning stages and we conduct that pilot, we're hoping to integrate ECM with file analysis and have those couple, because there's a great value add with combining these technologies, the capabilities of metadata tagging, auto categorization, and identifying that redundant data and the PII. Sometimes that's already baked into ECM, but if it's not, you then get that whole picture. And the file analysis, as I had that example about those millions of files, file analysis is what I use to get intellectual control. It is simply impossible for a person to look at 10 million files. And it's not supported by management for a person to look at 10 million files. So I used file analysis to identify thousands of redundant files that could be then deleted, because you don't need 6,000 copies of a README file, you need one. And then getting reports of what type of formats there were, and then getting those indexed results of what type of records are these. And that's how I was able to describe that accession and make sure that it was discoverable and did justice for the researchers in the future, so they didn't just see this blob that was messy and that they could never afford to get, but they could see what files contain. So is it actually relevant? And then for built-in retention policies, NIH has an Office 365 environment and uses Capstone. And with the built-in features of Microsoft, NIH can apply retention policies for Capstone and non-Capstone officials' emails accounts. And although we don't have the entire Microsoft ecosystem solved for retention and disposition policies, we're working actively with the Office 365 point of contacts to provide an ecosystem-wide solution. And for auto classification, as mentioned with ECM and file analysis, these are tools that have the capability to automate, and automation is key as federal agencies have tremendous volumes of electronic records produced each day, each year, and so forth. Sorting out records from non-record material, applying metadata tags to fulfill NAR requirements, organizing records. These are just a few ways to make electronic records management a sustainable and preferred method for managing records. So thank you all for attending this event. Apologies for going over on time. I hope this information is useful as your agency transitions to ERM and moves towards M1921 compliance. And I'm absolutely happy to answer any questions anyone may have.